And the first executive sends back an email. Disaster! Nobody wears shoes. The second executive, on the other hand, sends back their email. Fantastic business opportunity. Nobody wears shoes. So it's that kind of the art of possibility, and possibility is about, do we look for problems in the situation or do we look for the possibility in a situation? And it's looking about kind of abundance and, you know, as I say, having a conversation about this. And we normally grow up in a world of measurement. What's good? What's bad? Somebody's better than me. You know, who's going to be a friend? Who's a foe? It's almost like we've come from that jungle. We've come from that attitude of survival, and we're always comparing and measuring things, and you know, all the rest of it. We are grading people. We are comparing them automatically all the time. You know, when we meet somebody, what's the waitress like? What about the other drivers on the A38? I know I do that a lot. And not many of them get an A, I have to say. And then we're kind of looking at, well, what are those possibilities? You know, how are we grading? How are we kind of comparing people, measuring people? So in the University of Southern California, they have a leadership course every year, and they pick the top 50 students from their 27,000 students to do this course. But when they come to the end, the people who are grading those students are instructed only 1/3 can get an A, 1/3 get a B, and 1/3 get a C. So the grades don't relate to the work done. They relate to some kind of concept of measurement or comparison or a standard. So Ben came across this when he was teaching at the New England Conservatory. He was dealing with postgraduate music students, and he found they were so focused on the grade they were going to get, were they going to get an A, that they really were unwilling to take risks with their playing. They weren't very creative. They just wanted to know, what can I do to get an A? And he came up with this idea that he went in September and he would say to the students, you've all got an A. One condition. You write me a letter, based, at the end of the course, and you write me a letter that starts, Dear Mr. Zander, I got my A because, and you talk in that letter about all the things that you did, the insights that you had, the person that you became in order to get that A. So here's a kind of excerpt from one of them. Dear Mr. Zander, in Taiwan, I was number 68 out of 70 students. I come to Boston, and Mr. Zander says I'm an A. Very confusing. For 3 weeks, very confused. I'm number 68. I'm an A. I'm number 68. Mr. Zander says I'm an A. One day I discover, much happier A than 68. So I decide I am an A. So you can see there that it's all invented. The A is invented. The 68 is invented. It's about whether we choose to invent something that brings some kind of enlightenment, some light and joy into our life, some idea of possibility. So like the second marketing executive rather than the first one. Are we looking at the possibilities here or the problems? So then in this book they extended this idea of giving an A and thinking, well, how could we do this? How can we take this out of the academic environment? So could we give an A in relationships? What I realised was that I have a story about my father. He gave me the story, you work really hard and you never have enough money. He was in the civil service for many years. He never got beyond a grade 5. He was kind of a bit distant. He'd read the paper at the table. He wasn't really into hugs. He was a little bit tactless, embarrassing with the neighbours. I felt that I wasn't ever good enough. I thought that my sister was his favourite, and I kind of felt like I was always trying to kind of get his attention and never did. Anyway, interestingly enough, when I was preparing for this talk today, I read an account in the chapter where Ros talked about reframing her relationship with her own father. She felt that he didn't love her, that he didn't know her. But when she reframed it and gave him an A, she kind of thought maybe he was distant from her because he didn't feel he had anything to offer her. So I remembered a letter I had from my father back in 1976, here, probably the only letter I ever had from him. And it was when I hadn't got a scholarship to Gordonstoun. So here's an excerpt. Dear Alison, if you put yourself In a position of winning something, you must be prepared to accept disappointment if it comes instead. If one misses the bus, one must learn to walk. And then he uses an example of his own work in civil service and says that whenever he had a disappointment, when he got passed over once more, that he felt he had to do his work better to show them that he hadn't been brought down by it. So in that sense, what I'm seeing there from my father is that he wanted to protect me from disappointment, that he wanted to encourage me there. And I also found another letter. I discovered a letter that I'd written to him. What about the other part of that equation in giving an A? So here's a letter that I wrote to him about a month before he died, in 91. I'd never ever said to him in person that I loved him. So here's this letter. Dear Dad, I love you and I'm glad and proud to have you as my father. I've always felt that you were there for me. When it was important, you always came through, and I always felt that you were on my side. So I kind of thought, so I have this story, you work really hard and you never have enough money, and I've been kind of blaming him and giving him a kind of, failing grade, if you like, for a time. He died he died 20 years ago. But when I look at these letters, what I see there is an evidence, if I look and I reframe that relationship, that we were giving each other an A all along. So how great was that? So thanks to Liz and Stu for asking me to do this presentation today, because I rediscovered that. So the next thing is to think about how might that work in my own relationships. If I give somebody an A in a relationship, how would that change the dynamic between us? And you also have to give up that feeling of, I'm good and generous and I'm giving you an A and you're fantastic. It's not about that. It's about saying, instead of being that adversarial, I'm grading you, I'm going to step into partnership with you and we're going to have a conversation about possibility. Sometimes that's pretty challenging. What if you're in an abusive relationship, for example? So you might then decide, if you reframe that as giving an A, that could be actually saying, well, nobody is actually really happy if they're abusing somebody else. So by staying in this relationship and accepting this, then I'm actually being cruel to you too. It's quite difficult in that. So what that might do is encourage you to have a conversation about setting limits, or it might be about, well, I'm having to leave this relationship. And it's looking at being in a relationship and looking at your own responsibility for being in that relationship, but from the sense of responsibility, the ability to respond. It's not about condoning that behaviour, it's just about how you respond to it. And you changing and giving an A rather than giving the other person a failing grade and saying that they're wrong. So finally, I'm just going to talk about giving myself an A. That's the toughest one, I think, when you actually come from that. It's like, it's always hard to kind of take on kind of good feedback, I think. You make a mistake, oh God, how could I be so stupid? How could I have done that? I can't possibly do that. How can they love me? I'm not good enough for this. When I deliver a course, all too often what I'm going to do is I look at the feedback that I get, oh, good, excellent, good, and then I get to the two at the end that say you were rubbish and your slides are, awful. Oh, and that's what I focus on. So I'm always thinking, oh, I can feel miserable about that, rather than looking at kind of good feedback. So if you make a mistake and you give yourself an A, you can actually look at that as a learning opportunity and you can create a possibility out of that. And in fact, Ben Zander has this wonderful thing where he says, oh, if you make a mistake, you go, how fascinating! And then you kind of move on. So how great would that be? And I can always remember hearing him in the head, how fascinating. And think about that when I'm making a mistake. So A is not an expectation to live up to, it's a possibility to live into. So giving myself an A, wow, cue another letter. Found another one in my little pile of letters here from myself. This is from 2007. I wrote at the end of a personal development course where we were encouraged to write about how we were feeling about ourselves at that particular moment. So it says, Dear Alison, you are a sexy, attractive, feisty woman. You are a great friend, a fantastic mother to your brilliant children. You are so willing to go out there and create fantastic opportunities. You are powerful in the best sense. You enable others to be the best they can be. So how would it feel if you got a letter like that? And how would it feel if it came from you? And in a minute I'm going to invite you to write just such a letter. So it's almost about, if you give yourself an A, if you give other people an A in relationships, it's guaranteed to have an effect on the person that you're in a relationship with, just by changing your story. And also, you know, I would encourage you to continue and experiment with giving an A when you go out there into the real world, although it may be very difficult with the white van drivers on the A38, but we can try. And actually think about, how would that be? How about if am I giving an A to my clients? Really? How might our conversation change if I did that? And also think about, if all of the people in this room are giving an A, what an amazing area of possibility Devon will be.